Hello. I'd like to, first off, before we begin, thank Kevin Jen of Alexandria, Kevin, for recommending this video in his feed. This video has challenged me and taken me out of my comfort zone, as what we're going to speak about is outside of my wheelhouse. While I have a very long, documented journey through theology, this is an area that I don't usually study or speak upon. And I'm also grateful, and I would like to thank Majesty of Reason for making his rebuttal. Me and him disagree profoundly, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate a good challenge and expanding my mind, and also the amount of research I had to do to catch up and be on a level where at least what I was saying is coherent. That being said, I would like to challenge Kevin Jen of Alexandria directly to respond to this video, not to my initial knee-jerk reactions in my watch-along streams, as those were just knee-jerk reactions. They were not well thought out, and they were not well researched. This is as well researched as I'm going to be able to get, given my time constraints, given my life situation and work. So, Kevin, I would like you to respond to this video if you get the chance, and of course, if you're willing. All right, let's do this. Defending the arguments of Aquinas and Trent Horn against objections from Hume, Nietzsche, Foucault, and Schmidt, Majesty of Reason. And for those wondering, I am not calling out Schmidt by using his real name. While I am completely comfortable with pen names, he uses Schmidt on the articles that he writes. And I'm going to be responding to those as well as to his video in this response. I had already edited a video responding to Schmidt when I realized that my review of his critique wasn't accurate enough to meet my aims. I am not an expert on Aquinas, Anselm, or Fraser, nor am I well read in their era of philosophy or theology. My philosophical journey has focused more on Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, leading me to thinkers like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. While along the way, I've also spent considerable time with Kant, Hegel, and Kierkegaard. In terms of theology, my path has been quite different from Joe's. For 15 years, I immersed myself in works like the Tao Te Ching, the Book of Five Rings, The Art of War, and Machiavelli. And not just The Prince, but his other works as well, and his play. It's only in the last 7 years that I've turned to the Church Fathers. And no, I do not mean the medieval doctors of the faith. I'm talking about the Church Fathers. Those Christians from the early Christian period, roughly between 30 AD and 450 AD. Given this background, I initially felt unqualified to speak assertively about the disagreement at hand. I conducted 2 watch-along streams where I shared my raw reactions to Schmidt's objections. After reading his WordPress article refuting Fraser, I now feel more confident in responding to what Schmidt presents as critiques and objections. However, I wouldn't call them rebuttals. In the car business, we refer to these kinds of objections as whines. It is clear that Schmidt was never seriously buying these arguments. He was merely kicking tires. This renders his objections superfluous and superficial at best, and distracting at worst. The philosophical debate over the existence of God and the proofs thereof is long-standing and complex. Figures like Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of Canterbury have presented classical arguments for God's existence, while critics such as David Hume, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Michel Foucault have raised significant objections. Recently, apologists like Trent Horn, William Lane Craig, and Gavin Ortlund have revisited these classical arguments, while opponents such as Joe Schmidt, Majesty of Reason, align more with the critiques of thinkers like Hume. This essay aims to defend classical theology and Catholic apologetics, particularly their arguments for objective morality and miracles. Though I respect Aquinas, Anselm, and Fraser, my faith is not rooted in Thomistic theology. That said, I own Aquinas' works in both print and audiobook form. I am familiar with the name Edward Fraser, and I consume a fair amount of content from the Thomistic Institute. However, I do not identify as a Thomist, nor have I ever been inclined to do so. Similarly, while I follow Trent Horn's Council of Trent YouTube channel, and I find his apologetics interesting, I've never been fully convinced by his arguments, and I often disagree with his approach. Thomistic theology is frequently misrepresented or weighed down by unnecessary baggage from its interlocutors. whether supporters or critics. Aquinas is often a target for beginner, atheist, and online skeptics. Unfortunately, both his defenders, Christian apologists, and detractors, atheists and anti-theists, tend to miss the point of his work, arguing over conclusions he never actually claims. Personally, my faith is not based on Aquinas' supposed logical rigor or his 5 ways to prove God's existence. Nevertheless, common objections to Aquinas' 5 ways, like those presented by Joe Schmid against Trent Horn, are equally unsatisfactory. They often fail to understand the purpose and scope of Aquinas' theology and argue against claims that Aquinas never intended to make. I want to be clear. I am not saying that they underestimate the scope of Aquinas' theology. I'm saying that they overestimate the scope of Aquinas' theology, of what he is claiming it can actually prove. Trent Horn's so-called new argument for God seems to draw heavily on Aquinas' 5 ways: the arguments for motion, efficient causation, possibility and necessity, gradation of truth, and theology. In my view, Horn also incorporates elements from Anselm in his broader case for God's existence, and also gives a nod to the moral argument. Additionally, Horn appeals to miracles as evidence of God's existence, focusing more on public apparitions than personal experiences. Together, these elements form what Horn calls a new argument for God, which essentially combines classical arguments into one cumulative case. Though I am not personally convinced by the case Trent Horn builds or by the individual arguments he highlights, what he chooses to highlight about them, Aquinas and Anselm remain serious philosophical contributors. Their works and arguments will be wrestled with long after Joe Schmid and other modern objectors are forgotten. Regarding public apparitions, aside from Paul's vision of Jesus and Constantine's sign of victory, such visions hold minimal relevance to my faith. That said, when critiquing Horn's presentation, one common objection stands out: the alleged leap in logic from the necessity of a prime mover to the existence of the Christian God. Skeptics and naturalists often assert that while Aquinas' arguments might demonstrate the existence of a first cause or prime mover, they fail to prove the existence of the Christian God specifically. However, as many have pointed out, that's not what Aquinas intended them to prove in the first place. Schmid, however, takes a different approach. Rather than focusing on this common objection, he adopts an attitude of, "But I don't find this persuasive." This sentiment becomes especially apparent when reading his articles objecting to classical and modern theology regarding the existence of God or the Trinity. I don't know Joe Schmid's personal beliefs, but his critique doesn't seem to be purely Humean, as in Hume, David Hume, or Nietzschean, though I do detect traces of Hobbes' radical self-interest in his reasoning. It'd be interesting if it turns out that he might be an Ayn Randian as well. Regardless of Schmidt's specific objections, many of the most vocal critics repeat the familiar charge that these arguments involve leaps in logic. Most claim that the missing link is the connection between the first cause and the Christian God. Furthermore, they argue that even if a prime mover exists, there is no reason to believe that this is the omnipotent, omnipresent, and incorporeal God described by classical theology, let alone the God presented in the Bible, or I should say, the biblical text. Schmid, however, seems unwilling to grant the existence of a prime mover or sufficient first cause. Instead, he prefers to debate definitions. His concept of God, or an ultimate being, seems to differ significantly from that of most online apologists, Orthodox Catholics, traditional Christians, or classical theologians. His dialectic often centers on comparing the accidents of God to the properties of said item. In his article, this said item is, or concept, is the number 2, implying that the very concept of God is, in his view, impossible. On this point, I offer 2 thoughts. Either he seeks to make all numbers gods or divinities, or he's simply uncomfortable with abstractions, paradoxes, and mysteries. The remedy to this discomfort is simple. Learn more about Eastern Christian mysticism, or spend a few years contemplating Taoism. and its teachings, my history with Taoism, as I mentioned earlier, and my inclination toward Greek religious mysticism have made me comfortable with paradox and mystery, intellectual gifts for which I am grateful. Hume and his ilk base their critique on empiricalism and skepticism. In general, they argue that human understanding is limited by sensory experience, and any metaphysical claims, such as the existence of God, go beyond what can be empirically justified. Hume's naturalistic view leads him to deny that morality or causation necessarily point to God. Essentially, Hume argues that objective morality can be explained through human reason and social systems, rather than by divine decree. However, this critique presupposes a naturalistic worldview. There is no clear reason why natural morality would exclude the possibility of God. In fact, many Christians argue that the very existence of natural morality points to the presence of a divine lawgiver. In contrast, Aquinas' approach to morality and causality asserts the necessity of a first cause, one that is uncaused, that is uncreated and independent of the universe. For example, Aquinas' argument from gradation suggests that degrees of truth, goodness, and beauty in the world point toward an ultimate source of all perfection, which he identifies as God. While skeptics dismiss these arguments as logically unsound, their critiques often assume a naturalistic framework that presupposes the conclusions they seek to defend. In my initial reactions to Trent Horn's video, I observed that Trent Horn didn't present a new argument for God, but merely compiled old arguments without significantly addressing their objections. Nevertheless, if the existence of God is true, then God exists independent of whether or not the Bible is true. And I don't know anyone who claims that Aquinas' 5 ways are the foundation of their faith. For these reasons, I didn't engage with Trent's presentation when Catholic Answers published it weeks ago, because I found the arguments irrelevant to my personal belief. While I respect Trent Horn's efforts, my faith came long before I encountered philosophical arguments for God's existence, or experienced miracles that later reaffirmed my Catholic faith. These miracles were significant in my return to the Catholic Church, but my belief in God was already established before I became a confirmed Catholic. In defending Aquinas and Anselm, Horn seeks to integrate their classical arguments into a cohesive case for God's existence. Joe Schmid, however, overlooks much of what is said in order to attack what he thinks is meant. Similarly, Hume's empirical approach cannot adequately account for the binding nature of moral obligations if they are merely products of human consensus. The objections of philosophers like Nietzsche and Foucault add another layer to this critique. Like many philosophers, Joe adopts a tone of intellectual superiority that can alienate those unfamiliar with his arguments. I noticed this in his presentation, and while it may seem unfair, I recognized it as a form of arrogance, one I've seen even in myself. When we examine the arguments from morality, we find a compelling case for God's existence, grounded in the nature of moral truths. Christian apologists argue that moral values are objective and cannot be explained without reference to a higher being. Hume, conversely, argues that morality is subjective and can be understood purely through human reason and social conditioning. Foucault takes it further, arguing that morality is relative and a man-made construct designed to control those weaker in power and privilege. As for Nietzsche, he often plays the contrarian, more concerned with challenging norms than building a cohesive moral theory. He deserves a separate critique for any meaningful engagement. However, the Christian apologist position emphasizes that if morality is truly objective and universally binding, it must have its source in something beyond human reason, namely God. The objections raised by Joe, Hume, Foucault, and Nietzsche ultimately fall short because they presuppose a naturalistic and empirically constrained worldview. They assume that if something cannot be proven through direct sensory experience or repeatable verification, it cannot be true. This overlooks the possibility of one-off single events and metaphysical truths, such as the existence of a prime mover or an objective moral order, which transcend empirical verification, yet remain philosophically sound. Joe attempts a strategy Nietzsche attributes to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Clever men trick strong men into thinking they are weak for not knowing some obscure esoteric objection. Joe plays the cynic and sophist, poking holes in arguments he presupposes to be false. To be fair, this critique of Schmid may be too harsh. I would like to see him build a positive case for his implied positions and declare them outright. As it stands, I can only respond to what he has said and the tone he's taken in the single video of his I have watched, and the very few WordPress articles of his I have read, not to what he might or might not have meant. I want to add a few additional thoughts, focused more on Joe Schmid's article, The Neoclassical Challenge Vindicated, a response to Fraser. These thoughts may be a bit more scattered and less cohesive. Joe's original video, The New Rebutted Case for God's Existence, responding to Trent Horn's Catholic Answers presentation, The New Case for God's Existence, Modern Proof, also warrants further reflection. Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, and John Henry Newman are all important figures in this debate. However, I gave little to no attention to Kant and Newman in my response to Joe Schmid, for which I apologize. The arguments from conscious, or the moral argument, for belief in God is significant for many Christians across different denominations, sects, and faith traditions. Unfortunately, I didn't do enough to properly define or defend this argument for God's existence. While I do believe in divine command theory, it is not the foundation for my belief in God, nor the basis for my ethics or principles. That said, Joe Schmid makes it clear that he rejects such claims as valid proofs of God's existence. Defending this argument simply because I believe it is true doesn't advance the conversation, as it doesn't prove God's existence per se, only that objective commands can exist. This brings us to another apparent disagreement between Schmid and myself. He seems to imply that humanity's dignity is inherent and that each individual's moral worth is inalienable. Based on my life experience, I disagree. Yes, I'm one of those Christians who believes not all things need to have a necessary cause. And to that extent, not all things possess moral value. And degradation, as well as abomination, not only exist, but are realities. There are humans who act and live in ways that could be described as subhuman. And there are humans who are treated as both less than or more than human. To deny this is to deny reality. Another area of disagreement and a potential source of future misunderstanding between Schmid and myself is the distinction between concretes and abstracts. I believe in abstracts, just to be clear. And from his article, I get the impression that Schmid doesn't believe in abstracts or in ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is a core belief in my philosophical framework. While unity and simplicity, argued from the point of uniqueness, are not central to my Christian formation, they are still key elements of dogma in my chosen faith. There's also an issue with Schmid not recognizing that what may seem irrelevant to him could still be highly relevant to the person he is debating. The irony or hypocrisy here is that what's irrelevant for him may not be irrelevant to the person he is arguing against, and vice versa. Lastly, as I mentioned in the main portion of this response, we seem to be arguing over different definitions of God, an ultimate being, a prime mover, and a first cause. For something to be a first cause doesn't mean it cannot use agents to create subsequent causes or strings of causation. Nor does it mean that all chains or strings must begin at the same point or time, specifically since even time is a creation, which goes back to how I understand chaos and void. So to sum up, while I do not rely on Aquinas' 5 ways as the foundation for my faith, I find the criticisms of his arguments, and by extension, the objections to Anselm's, Edward Fraser's, and Trent Horn's arguments lacking. Naturalism provides a limited framework for understanding morality and causality. Naturalism, and I have no better word to call what I see in Joe Schmidt's opinions or objections. Naturalism provides a limited framework for understanding morality and causality, one that fails to account for necessity and actuality. Aquinas and Anselm offer compelling philosophical insights into these questions, and when properly understood, they present a formidable challenge to the empiricist skepticism of thinkers like Hume. By defending Aquinas and Anselm, we uphold not only classical theology, but also the possibility of objective morality and ultimate truth. Again, I would love for Kevin, if you're available, if you have time, to respond to this video. Joe, Majesty of Reason, you can respond to this, but I'm not playing on the same playing field as your objections, so this could be redundant for you to respond to and unchallenging. But if you do find it at all challenging, you're welcome to respond to it. I'm not playing on the same playing field as you are, so I would not want to assume such an honor. But Kevin, you and I think we're becoming friends based on our interactions, and I think we have good objections to each other. I would love to see you respond to this, and maybe we can turn this into a bigger conversation one-on-one in the future after I get, of course, your response. Everyone, please, please, please help me out. Hit that like button, hit the share button, comment down below, argue with me, tell me you think I'm right, tell me you think I'm wrong. I need all the engagement I can get. I am trying to grow this channel. We're getting closer to my next goal of subscribers, which unlocks even more things, which is awesome. And like I said, I'm trying to grow both as a creator and as a YouTuber, I guess. So help me out. Peace, like, and subscribe. Talk to you all later. Bye.